I think it's interesting to do comparative work, but obviously very complex and problematic as well. I'll let other people who are more experts on city planning in China, and both historically and in the contemporary periods, ask specific questions about the problems of that kind of comparative work across these cases. I have a simple question, which is, I have a pretty clear sense of who the client was and what your process was in New Orleans. I do not know what the parallel client or process was in Beijing.
If we chose to extend the study, we were only in Beijing for 3 days. As we said, this is the beginning of our study, and it was more a familiarization with those neighborhoods and understanding that they held great urban value that seemed to be being destroyed as we were there. We would choose to work with local clients. We would find groups or try to assemble groups of local stakeholders, which is obviously problematic, but possible, we feel, so that we could engage in a conversation about the neighborhood and be informed by people who lived there.
But were you invited in the same way that Nina reached out to you?
No, we didn't. This is totally something we took off our own bat, and it was based on that image, the demolition symbols. That for me, for both of us, I think, the resonance between what was happening in the destruction in New Orleans after the natural destruction. There was a concerted effort to destroy the lower Ninth Ward in a similar way to the way that Hutongs are being razed, with a similar kind of population of working class and very poor people. There were many plans to completely eradicate the lower Ninth Ward and turn it into a golf course. So we saw similarities between what was happening in that context and in the context of the Hutongs, where people were disenfranchised, basically. Yeah.
Just to add to that, I also, and maybe this is helpful, maybe not, to answer your question. I think that we felt that we were, we utilized a specific approach when we worked on our project in the Ninth Ward with our client who needed something specific from us. And we had an interdisciplinary approach to solving this one specific problem, which was set in a city. So we really are just taking this idea of how do you approach a problem. Doesn't have to be the same problem in the same area with the same people. It's just an approach to how do you explore an issue in the context of a city.
But the approach is fundamentally different if you're approached by a client versus going in and doing that methodology. That's what I don't understand.
Yeah, we actually went to New Orleans and interviewed a number of different clients in New Orleans before we started the project. They interviewed us, we interviewed them, and we had conversations with maybe 8 to 10 different nonprofit groups before we mutually chose each other. Nina chose us and we chose Nina. So it was a process of exploration in a very similar way to what we're suggesting here. We really sought out an organization that we thought, where the process could be mutually beneficial, basically.
Can I just follow up?
Yeah.
Is he waving at you, or is he actually resisting?
No, he was, he didn't want to be associated with anything that was happening in the neighborhood. He didn't want to be recorded being there in that way. So he didn't want a record of himself. We asked him, could we take a photograph? And he said, okay, maybe, okay, that'll be fine. We asked because we had a student with us who spoke Chinese before we took it. But he was embarrassed.
We've talked sometimes on when we were discussing design, and I think in this article that you mentioned by Tom Robbins, there's something about how the solution comes after, like that you start designing the process and then you find the solution. So my question would be, now that you've started with taking a look at the Hutongs, can you localize the problem?
Well, it's the destruction is at the moment, the problem is the destruction by the Chinese government of these areas.
But there are
why?
so many, there's so many problems that are associated with this destruction. It's not simply that people are being moved or that a community is being lost, or that a place for affordable housing for people, for a working class group of people is going away, or the historic significance. I mean, there's so many different parts of the problem, and there is no one solution to what's happening here. But what we felt was there is a sense of urgency. There aren't a whole lot of these Hutongs left in Beijing compared to what was there 5 years ago even. So we're just responding to this urgent matter of something that will be gone soon, but we're not proposing that there is any one solution, and we're not saying that there is any one specific problem with what's happening here, because there are so many issues at hand with this specific example.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. No, I agree it's a complex reality, but I think that to make it like to really comprehensive, I think that we have to understand that for many people this is not a problem.
Yes.
And not just, I'm not talking about the developers or the government, for many of these people, maybe for him, if he was not here, that would not be a problem.
Yes.
But absolutely the opposite.
And there are a lot of the younger people, and I think Alison mentioned this, a lot of the younger people in Beijing don't want to have anything to do with this. They don't, that's not a desirable way of living, and they don't want to live in this environment. So it is not an optimal place to live, but it is something that is important to the context of Beijing. And it is important that people have an affordable place to live that's close to the city center. So, you know, again, yeah, there are a lot of reasons why this isn't a great place to live, but there are a lot of things that are important that the Hutongs achieve or that they stand for. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, definitely. But I still think that sometimes we come to Beijing with a lot of assumptions. Living close to the city center is a good thing.
It is if you work in the city. Most people work, I mean, if you think about where the locations of commerce are in a city, there's this modern strategy, the poor can live on the outside of the city and the wealthy can live on the in. And the poor can commute from the suburbs and the outer rings, like in Paris, for example. All the outer rings are minorities, poor people who live out there, and they're warehoused out there. But where do they work? They don't work there. They work in other areas that they have to commute to. So this understanding of the city, the downtown of the city, as being only a place for commerce and for the wealthy isn't, I mean, we started with a whole kind of exploration of the way we consider an ideal city should work, and that is where you have a mix of people in all neighborhoods. And we're coming at it from both a design sense and also a financial sense. So if you understand that our backgrounds, Desiree is not a designer. Her background is building development. So our backgrounds are very different, and we're trying to mesh these two competing forces and saying, what does this mean when we think about the city? How can we combine these two efforts and start to make a city that's more livable, that's more equitable?
And I'll acknowledge, this is a very difficult issue to tackle, and it's not even one issue. There's so many pieces to this story. And in the beginning of this presentation, I really hope to set up kind of that understanding that this is not, there are so many stakeholders in this, and there are so many different points of view that must be considered in any of these redevelopment or redesign endeavors. And there is no one solution. It's not really for us to say that it's not better to put, an 8th ring road for a certain group of people to live in. That isn't for us to say, but it is part of the discussion that needs to happen. It is part of the goal setting for any planning design effort in any city.
I think you have to have the conversation, and there's no conversation at the moment.
Yes, I was wondering if you could just go back to the discussion of New Orleans and what happened, the politics within the 9th Ward, of how that discussion took place there, and how divisive or how much consensus there was in the final outcomes.
You mean with our client specifically, or you mean?
No, not with the clients, in the community. So partly a sense of, rather than trying to look at the community as a whole, the internal politics within the community.
It depends on how you define the community. In the city of New Orleans, and maybe even in the state of Louisiana, there's a lot of, there's not a whole lot of concern about what happens to the people in the Ninth Ward. Our client really, there were so many, let me step back. Our client was she's one of the many not-for-profits that are operating in the lower Ninth Ward right now. And there's a coalition of these not-for-profits so that they can actually try to move toward a common goal so that they're not competing with each other for scarce resources. Even within that coalition, within a neighborhood that is so desperately in need of help, there were disagreements about who was going to do what, and we want to use this money to build a preschool, but there's a very strong need for a high school in the area. There are a lot of political issues just within the community. For the specific project that we worked on, there were no, or let me rephrase it, there didn't appear to be too many conflicting or competing efforts for the specific project that we were trying to build with our client. So is that helpful at all?
Our client looks mostly to private funding for its projects, getting loans through foundations and loans from banks. So it's not looking small amount of government kind of access to government grants, but not too much, right? I mean, it's really acting as a broker in a way for its local community groups. So it really uses a business model as a way of forwarding its aims. So it's in the process of packaging a parcel of land from the Louisiana,
The New Orleans Recovery Authority.
New Orleans Recovery Authority is selling parcels of land. So it's going to purchase 40 parcels of land, for example, and become a broker then for individual community members who want to return to that neighborhood. And it puts together the business package, the finance package, the insurance package, which is a huge deal in New Orleans, and gives them access to the land. It also offers them design services. So what they do is they have this complete in-house approach to serving their clients, because their clients have very limited access to those services outside of the community. So their approach is to really try to do everything in-house to support this mission of bringing people back. So that was their approach. That's their mission, is around housing. And the community building that we were designing for them and these other things that they were doing was really to enhance their mission, to have a better place to work for them, but also to increase their prominence in the neighborhood, so that they really were seen as being a force within the neighborhood, so that they could gain more a status there as a community group, but also more influence in terms of local government, that they were seen to be a major player in this particular neighborhood. So a very canny kind of way of positioning themselves to take advantage of all and everything to really push their mission forward.
Thank you for the presentation, and I appreciate that you're trying to push the conversation about what's happening in Beijing. But one thing I wanted to bring up is that conversation's actually been happening for a very long time. So to imply that there hasn't been a conversation about the destruction of the Hutongs is a bit misleading. It's been extensive within China for more than 10 years. For those of us who work in sociology, anthropology, urban planning, this has been happening for a very long time. And so there's a lot of discourse there and research that's been done on that. But something I think that you might have inadvertently iterated that I think is problematic about how that conversation's been happening is, in general, even when we're being very well-meaning, we tend, I use we because it happens all the time, to speak for men like him without ever actually having spoken with him.
You did speak with him.
Yes, but you've spoken very generally
Yes.
about the problems in this area, whether people should be working in the center of the city, whether they should be living on the periphery, what your sense of an ideal city is. And I would suggest that whatever the sense of any given neighborhood is within Beijing that happens to or not to be a Hutong, that if you're going to speak on behalf of the so-called impoverished, that you should let them speak rather than speaking for them, which would mean doing extensive household income surveys, doing extensive data analysis on their family histories, trying to understand exactly where do they work. Is it permanent labor? Is it temporary labor? You know, and it takes a while, and it's a very detailed social economic process, but I think then you do have a greater position to make those claims on behalf of those people. But until you do it, I think that might be part of what feels very suspect right now to some of us in the room, is speaking in that way without the data yet. And I know you're probably planning on doing it, but that, you know, I'd suggest that that would probably be helpful for everyone. And just maybe as a side, and maybe it's because I work in this area a lot, I wouldn't show that photo of him because there are a lot of ethical reasons that that's really, really disturbing, particularly since it's clear he was resisting you, and you then ask, can we take your photo, but he told you he didn't really want to be associated with the place, and yet you've documented him and are showing him. And I would suggest that that's really problematic.
Thank you. I just want to respond quickly. I agree with you, and all of that information and that you were just talking about, gathering information about the people who live there and income studies and whatnot. Those are very important parts of the equation. In New Orleans, in our project in New Orleans, our not-for-profit client, that is part of what they do. They are documenting and including not just who owns the land, but where are those people now? Do they have jobs? Are they planning on coming back? If they're not planning on coming back, how can we assist them? If they are planning on coming back, what do they need to be in place, and what steps do they need to take to actually make that happen? So our client in that specific project that we actually did work on is really does have that information. They really do understand who they're working with and working for, and what their mission is completely based on that one thing. So that particular project that we were working on has had a lot of background information that was informing what needed to go there, and maybe this answers an earlier comment that it wasn't a very controversial. The particular project that we did in New Orleans was not a very controversial project, in part because we had all of that information, because our client had done all of that background work. So I agree with you, and really, you know, I don't want anybody here to think that we purport to be experts on Hutongs at all. It was a topic that we read the Mears book about him living in the Hutong. We thought it was very interesting what was happening. We saw some parallels between the work that we were doing, and we thought that we could kind of present a methodology for exploring that idea. So I want to reiterate that we are not experts on Hutongs. We're not experts on city planning. We're just presenting a way of thinking about approaching a problem within the urban context.
I do appreciate your effort in New Orleans and Beijing, but I do agree with Shannon, especially her very last point. As someone who has been living in the Hutong in the last a year and a half, I cannot help noticing a trend which is really bothering me, that Hutong, especially demolition sites in Hutong, has increasingly become a tourist attraction, especially for Western tourists who will tour with their guide and stop at various demolition sites and take a photo, and the photo usually consists of kind of juxtaposition between the demolition rubbles and the rising skyline. This is, image of a disappearing past and a rising future, which has become a sort of a cliche in contemporary art as well as the Western media. But it's hard for these tourists to imagine. Maybe 2 weeks after they left, there are new courtyard houses been built right on the very site. What has been happening, especially in the last 2 years, is the government are tearing down those really the courtyards in bad quality and replacing them with replica of Seheyuan. Of course, that has problem, but the residents are still the residents who were used to be there. Mm-hmm. But it's really hard for somebody who really spent 2 weeks in Beijing and happen to see that rupture and then imagine that there's something replace that. But I'm just wondering, well, if you want to explore this research project further, I'm wondering if you could look at the typology of Hutong. There are many different kinds of Hutong in Beijing, and the typology of Hutong 5 years ago is very different from today. There are, I don't remember the exact number, but around 19 protective zones. I don't remember the exact number, but within these zones, you cannot touch anything. But there's also a problem within these zones. It's not a radical, brutal demolition, but rather theme parkification of Hutong and the Seheyuan. And the trendy cafes is this kind of things that remove the residents. And when you go there, you don't feel the spirit of old Beijing. There's no original community is the urban yuppies and the tourists, right? So I'm just in kind of suggestion to explore that typology, and different types of Hutong really have very different sets of problems. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I did want to respond really quickly too to the tourist.
Yeah.
Because when we are working in New Orleans, that happens. Every day, tour buses go through the Ninth Ward. Giant tour buses, just driving through the neighborhood, looking at the neighborhood and the destruction that's happened in that neighborhood, and it is deeply disturbing to the residents there as well. That they have become, part of a tourist attraction when they're living, their homes have been destroyed. They're living in, very poor conditions if they're living there at all, and it is similar. So it's interesting to hear you say that is a tourist destination also in Beijing to see this destruction as well.
I think we do, though, understand that the value of land has increased in the inner area of Beijing, within the kind of the area kind of defined by the old city walls. And I think when you start to understand that the value of land increases in those areas, you do start to marginalize the kinds of populations that can live there. So the destruction of an area that was traditionally a working class neighborhood, for example, where there are numerous families living in a building that was designed for far few people, when 5 or 6 families may live within the confines of a very small house. When you look at that kind of density and you look at the demolition of that site, those sites are not being replaced with the people that were originally on the site. I mean, the value of the land and the kinds of development that are going on in those sites are really aimed at a totally different group of people. And that really is one of the issues for us. And I think, whether we've only been there for a short amount of time or not, the acknowledgement of the city as a place for all of us, not just the powerful, not just the rich, not just the government officials, to have a say in the life of our city is really the agenda for us. And I think, it's obviously complicated in a totalitarian state where people don't have the right or the opportunity to debate, to discuss, to protest their eviction from these places. But it is an issue that really needs to, and I understand that people have been exploring this for a long time, but the Hutongs are still being destroyed. They're still being removed. People are still being removed from these locations and relocated elsewhere at great distances from their original communities. Old people, young people, whatever. That's the conversation we'd really like to have, because that to us is really the parallel in many cities of the world, that the dispossessed are unseated from their homes. So.
Thank you for the discussion. I have to say I agree with the two previous points, and I wanted to bring something up that's perhaps productive and in that regard. We have talked a lot in this workshop about different notions of design, especially notions of design that are not necessarily designing for something, designing for change or for development, but really looking at different notions of design, of different kinds of engagement. Also, not looking as, for example, doing qualitative research as something that is impacting, solutions for design. And this discussion also really reminded me of, in the technology field, there is a huge development called ICT 4D, which basically means Information Communication Technologies for Development. And this has been hugely criticized within the technology community because it very often renders the space to be designed for developing countries as a space that needs help from, very bluntly put, Westerners. And this has been hugely criticized, within the technology community and from the outside. It has also triggered very productive discussions around the role of design, and that's why I'm bringing it in here, because the traditional approach was very much so, doing a qualitative research project elsewhere and then coming up with a solution for this space, for development. And development is then very often sort of bracketed into, a positive change based on a pre-designed notion of what positive change means. And so I just wanted to bring up this notion of the design can, I think, be very productive in a project in regarding to urban development in China that is perhaps not used at the end process of a qualitative research engagement, but in dialogue with participants, with a qualitative within a qualitative project and an ethnography. So I just wanted to bring that notion of design back into the discussion, perhaps as a productive approach for that future work.
Well, not the previous respondent, but the ones before, have placed on the table, I think, for us is to open up maybe a conversation about what the relationship is between research and design. Because in a sense, I think it's very clear from your presentation and from the responses to it that this kind of situation that you're describing with the Hutongs and also with New Orleans is a situation that we find everywhere. In many, many cities in the world. And indeed, it's an index of economic, of growth or of stimulation of certain kind. Marshall Berman, in All That Is Solid That Melts into Air, pointed this out, maybe 3 decades ago. And this insight has been with us for a very long time. And when we see images of destruction, today it's the line between what has caused what we see as destruction, whether it's a natural disaster, as in the case of New Orleans, or it's a kind of what is commonly referred to as a man-made disaster, the disaster planning, right, of a kind of centralized top-down planning. This conversation, it seems to me, is percolating in many different ways. The details are obviously different in different cases, and you have to look into local histories to understand how debates on the ground are being incubated, as it were, and ways in which those anticipate different kinds of futures. The question seems to be really, whether we can use this moment, this opportunity, not only in the development of cities, but also in this conference itself, to start talking about what is the relationship really between design and research, which comes, whether they are enacted sequentially or whether they're enacted together as a process, and what sorts of outcomes they will allow us to anticipate. So in a sense, this is not even a question, it's a comment and an invitation, I think, to the audience to actually participate maybe a little bit more in this kind of conversation, because the sort of images that you showed us, I would say, are images that we all have seen, even those of us who've spent 2 days in Shanghai. The same kind of dynamic in the built form, the erasure of certain sorts of built forms, and they're being replaced by certain other kinds of built forms. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, we see this, but what do we see? What do we envision, as it were, to be the role that not just the role that we might play, but actually what is the place of theory in this conversation? That it seems to me is an opening or an invitation that a very sort of practice-based approach can throw open, And as I said, for me, it's not so much a conversation between us, my question to you, but actually, I would love to hear even other people in the audience respond with, let's say, the kinds of work that they are engaged in. The previous two respondents who spoke about their work in Beijing, about living in Beijing and their experiences, perhaps we can, open it out further to the audience.
And just to add to that, I don't know if you guys remember, way at the beginning of this discussion, we talked about a prescriptive approach, which is kind of top-down, this is the way it should be, these are your problems, versus this observational approach, and Alison likes to say it's way more than observation, it's interaction, it is a discussion, and it involves lots of research that can take lots of different forms. So again, I'm concerned that the ideas that we came here to say that this is a problem and we need to fix it, really what we're trying to do is provoke a discussion about here are some ways of approaching an issue, and here's an issue. So let's talk about some ideas about how this can turn into a conversation about approaching this issue, or do you have questions about how we might have approached this other issue that we worked on earlier in the year?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think we've all been here and people are tired or whatever, but we're maybe responding a little bit to the politics of comparing Katrina to Beijing and also the politics of even choosing China. But again, we've all are also interested in China. And I was just going to ask to hear a little bit, so how would you proceed with a project like this? In either case maybe, but maybe since most people here are maybe working more closely with China, how would you proceed in a situation with Beijing? Look to establish relations with NGOs, and then also how does this fit into the curriculum and your programs? Because I also understand that these are teaching and research programs where people are interested in global issues related to urban policy and all sorts of issues. So, how does this work in these different sort of registers?
That's actually a really good question, because we're just starting up a new semester, and we're continuing this project with the not-for-profit in New Orleans, with NINA. And it's a selective process for choosing the students who come. It's not that anybody can register. Really, what I strongly believe that the class is not about learning how to run a financial pro forma or researching policy. The class is really about understanding a process and applying what you know within the context of a process. And I tell that to students, that this is really a challenge to you to understand what, I'm working with policy and finance students who, and management students who don't necessarily embrace or even understand how design can work with them to achieve the goals that they're working on. And so, in my view, the context of our relationship and the course that we're working on is more about helping the students to learn that there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle of solving a problem. And it's not just about coming up with a great spreadsheet and a PowerPoint presentation. It is important to share a common language, and not just a common language with the design partner, but a common language with your client and with the group of people that you're trying to benefit in some way.
But practically what we're doing is we're trying to set up, within my school at least, special projects. So, I mean, it's a classic academic kind of activity. You set up a special project, and then you find a project that fits within that slot. So this particular competition fits within that special project category. But I could imagine that we could do something around the Hutongs, perhaps, but we would need to travel. We obviously believe it's very important to be in the place, to understand the place. I mean, and our time in New Orleans is really about traveling down to New Orleans and spending time on the ground there. And that requires money, of course. So, any of these projects requires some kind of financial relationship to support the work within the university. So we are intent on looking at collaborative opportunities and across the new school, and our colleagues will speak tomorrow morning about the relationship that we've had Parsons with the New School for Social Research, at looking at using anthropologists and geographers, all kinds of other kinds of thinking that inform what we do. Our group, it becomes wider and wider the longer we work on this process. So it's really looking for people who are interested in working in this kind of context, and not everybody is. People do like to be within their fields of interest. It's very difficult to go out of that and to have a conversation and not just rely on, I'm the expert in this, but to actually leave some of that at the door and have the conversation. I mean, we all know how difficult that is to do. To say, okay, I want to talk about things, the way Vijanti just said, can we have the conversation? That's the most difficult thing. And I think, but these projects within our university are ranged usually around special projects and independent studies. So.
But was there another piece to your question that we didn't answer?
No, I just want to hear more about
Okay, so I'm making notes. I'm going to read them. So this is a comment. And from what I'm hearing in the room, we're all worried about a sense of drive-by expertise in these case studies. And so the question in my mind becomes sort of philosophical. We've been reading Latour for the seminar, and in the Latourian model of politics as matters and objects of concern, I'm starting to wonder who has the right to be concerned. So, for instance, the world looked on with horror and concern at New Orleans, not just for its people, but as a loss of heritage or as a loss of general sort of human values that connects outwards to the world in many ways. So I start to sort of wonder then, at what point is that concern intrusive, or at what point is it necessary politically to maintain concern? That's me.
I think that's an excellent point. That there is some question, and even in New Orleans, about, do you have the right to drive through my neighborhood? And in fact, are you truly concerned about me and my neighborhood, or do you just want to look at it? So it's, thank you for that comment.
Yes, but what are we? Why are we here? Why are we interested in the things we're interested? Why are we in academia? Why are we teaching these students that we have? Our project in New Orleans is a relationship between people who live there and students who have a certain expertise. And we exchange information, we exchange skills. The not-for-profit teaches our students to start to see the world in a different way. That's useful for them. It's useful for them as they move forward. They get something from the relationship. The not-for-profit gets all kinds of tools that they can leverage to support their mission in New Orleans. It's a mutually supportive situation. We're not there to observe. We're not there to be passive theoreticians. We're actually there to do some work. And the work absolutely helps this organization.
Yeah, as an aside, our partner, Nina, was so incredibly thankful for the work that we did. She was, and so appreciative, and it really was, it actually had a huge impact on the students and on Alison and I to realize at the point that we kind of presented the work that we'd done to her, that she really did feel like this was something that was really going to be helpful to her in achieving her mission of helping the people in her neighborhood where she was born and grew up and still live.
And it's not bleeding heart liberalism. It's not saying, oh my God, those poor people, we have to help them. It's actually saying that I'm an architect, I have certain tools. I can help somebody who doesn't have those tools. I can go down there and the work that I do has value for them. I don't understand the way not-for-profits work. They can teach me about living in that neighborhood and the value of the community that they have there. That's useful for me, that's helpful for me, that helps me understand a particular situation. So I think we all should be concerned. I mean, we need to channel our concern in some way so that we just don't talk about it, we actually do something about it. But I think this, in this case, in the New Orleans case, is mutually beneficial.
I just want to speak to this issue that has been addressed by the last few speakers. Shannon talked about it, and we've had a couple of other comments on that as well, and that is the ethics of what was described here as Hutong demolition tourism, which certainly now adds to the list of kinds of tourism that we have. Academic tourism, which is what probably brings some of us here, golf tourism, adventure tourism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can go down the list forever. However, having said that, I'm kind of concerned because it seems to me that the implication is that some people are not discharging their ethical responsibilities, while others, which is the bulk of humankind who happen to be tourists, or bulk of, let's say, relatively affluent humankind, because there are, in fact, a large number of tourists all over the world. The question here is this, that you can go to a place like India, or Africa, or the Malay world in the early 20th century. Let's say you're a British traveler. I've read lots of British travel accounts to these places. And it's very clear that these travelers went there partly because they were trying to understand what England might have looked like in the 16th century. You can't really understand England in the 16th century living in England in the early part of the 20th century, 100 years ago, but you might be able to understand it if you went to India or to the Malay world or Africa or whatever. Okay? So I think the critique that is being leveled here, it seems to me, if one followed it to its logical conclusion, would make virtually all of us into some kinds of voyeurs, if I may put it this way. Because it seems to me that the critique has to be of tourism per se. Why devote all that energy to this particular thing called, Hutong demolition tourism? I mean, I agree that there may be ethical problems in displaying a photograph. It's the kind of thing that Tausig has talked about quite a lot in a book that he did several years ago. Okay, what happens when a cultural anthropologist shows photographs in a certain way? How do you place the photographs within the text? So forth and so on. But it seems to me that in some ways, if you're doing this kind of work, there are always going to be ethical problems which it's not very clear where one draws the line. And I thought I detected a kind of a, sort of like a lecture, in a way, on the ethical responsibilities that one has. But the ethical responsibilities, it seems to me, have to be diverted to the much larger question of tourism per se, not just particular kinds of tourism of which this, it seems to me, is an instance of. Right? And that means that then we would have to really look at much larger questions, and those have to do with the relationship between the North and the South, so forth and so on.
I'm sorry, I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the organizer of this set of events, and I'm going to do this as the last statement this evening, because I think this is getting kind of difficult. There are a number of things going on here, one of which is, if not an attack, certainly a presumed assumption about theory and the place of theory, and the way in which theory is simply an armchair exercise and somehow going to a place and doing good things for people who need good things done to them somehow outpaces theory in certain sorts of ways. And I want to exercise a very strong counter to that position in the name of theory. Theory does a whole range of things, not the least of which is that the positions you take, even in exercising a photograph like the kind of photograph you exercised, or going to New Orleans to engage with people, is premised upon a set of theoretical assumptions. You might not like to think that, or you might not think that you're predicated on a set of theoretical assumptions, but they're there, and it might be interesting to tease them out. I mean, I think the ethical questions, on the other hand, are of deep concern. It's not just, you know, the representation of the photograph in a room like this. It's what that photograph does in relation to the person who's being photographed. I mean, quite frankly, that photograph and the set of assumptions that go with them wouldn't have passed the institutional review board at my university. I mean, you wouldn't be allowed to engage in that kind of activity with university funding, doing research at the institution at which I'm located. I'm sorry, I mean, that's just, and I doubt whether it's the case at Berkeley or any University of California campus, and a whole range of others, to be perfectly honest. So I think there are actually quite deep ethical questions at issue over here. There are deep research design questions at play over here, and we'll come back to those, no doubt, tomorrow, that are quite problematic. I mean, as the host of this, I'm sorry to have to do this, but I just couldn't go on listening to the kinds of assumptions that were being circulated over here at a conference, at a seminar, an academy, that is a seminar in experimental critical theory. And to come into a place that is a seminar in experimental critical theory, to make the kinds of, not even critiques, to advance a set of assumptions that theory has no place in the world other than to sit in an armchair and issue judgments. I'm sorry, but I mean, it's just not welcome here, quite frankly. I'm sorry to put it in quite so blunt terms, but I've had my fill of it at this point in the seminar. I'm sorry. Having said that, I want to thank you for the talk, and maybe we should go.